today, and we really appreciate your time. My name is Jeanette, and I am a Penn class of 2014 graduate, and I'm honored to be your moderator today for this Future of Education event. So as you know, the pandemic has brought a lot of uncertainty to a lot of industries. So Penn and other institutions have been forced to offer online courses. And the Google search for the word online learning has grown exponentially over the past few months. And there has already been debate over the value of online education over in-person college education. So we're here today to talk about where does the future hold for higher education. We are very proud to have invited 4 superstar speakers who are all Penn alumni to join us today. And they will be talking from both the perspective of university as well as the technology, the education technology perspectives. So first of all, we want to welcome Jake Schwartz, who is the co-founder of General Assembly, the tech education company that specializes in today's most in-demand skills. Welcome, Jake.
Hi.
Hi. And second, we have Jordan Pascucci, who is joining us from Penn Admissions. She is the Associate Dean of Evaluation and Analysis at the University of Pennsylvania's Office of Undergraduate Admissions. Welcome, Jordan. Hi. And next we have Rajesh Bhargave, who is the Associate Professor of Marketing at Imperial College Business School. Welcome, Rajesh. And lastly, we have George Vishiani, who is a former edtech pioneer who developed early courses for online learning platforms such as Coursera and edX. Welcome, George. So before we start, I just want to quickly go over a few housekeeping rules. So first, we are recording this meeting. So if you don't want to be recorded, you can turn off your camera. And secondly, please respect all the speakers. So please mute yourself when you are not speaking. And thirdly, we have some time for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please leave it in the chat here on this Zoom link. So we will go over them at the end. And lastly, if you enjoy this event, please consider donating to the Penn Medicine for their research for coronavirus. We will paste the link at the end so you know where to donate. So we'll get started. So first I want to talk to our university perspective from Jordan. Jordan, so do you want to talk to us a little bit about what's been happening on Penn's campus? Particularly what's happening to the incoming class of 2020 and the other current students?
Great. I saw that I needed the host to unmute me. So yes, I'd be very glad to. It is an interest. I mean, I know that we're all incredibly tired of the word unprecedented, but it really is just so, there's no other way to describe it. From day to day, week to week, it sort of seems like just as people are starting to get their footing, there's a new element that emerges and introduces itself to, the year that is 2020. And what's exciting about this is that it presents opportunity at the same time that is presenting challenge. Education has historically been an industry that is very tough to change, at least at a fast pace. And this has really required us to overnight do things that had been taking years. And the acceleration that has created, and with it, yes, have been challenges, but at the same time, unlocking incredible potential in a variety of ways. What is a challenge is, at the university side, of course, there's all of the things that are outside of learning that American universities are typically known for, whether it's the network building, whether it's the student life, the community aspect. And all of that is something that, students that are embarking on their university career are really missing right now. But, you know, Penn, for example, has done a tremendous job of putting online over 700 student clubs and organizations, creating ways for the students to build those connections, find those interests, and keep going with their passions and building their network, even if everyone can't be in the same physical space. Penn's campus and the evolution of it over time has definitely been to create those physical connecting points where you can walk into, you know, the Center for Undergraduate Research and Fellowship. You can walk into one of the cultural resource centers. You can walk into Kelly Writer's house and find a like-minded learning community. But these communities have all been able to pivot online. And so the way that even convocation happened this year was really special, and really sending the signal that you are, you know, that Penn is bigger than just the physical space. And I think that the alumni community has been really powerful in exhibiting that well before we even had to make this move for our current students. The way that alumni communities around the world have stayed in touch and also stayed engaged with the university really laid a nice foundation for the university to understand how to bring that experience to current students. I have a lot to say, I think, about how this is impacting kind of K through 12 education around the world and what universities will have to look forward to as we prepare. But as far as being able to weather this moment, I think that the real resiliency that education, but especially Penn, has shown is pretty powerful. It occurred to me the other day that, you know, what has really been part of the Penn story for a long time has been able, this moment has allowed Penn to really step into the space that, you know, no worthwhile journey ever comes with calm seas, right? And that really it's about embracing the tension and the twists and turns and the bumps along the road that lead to real learning. And everything from, you know, in admissions, us being able to even evoke Ben Franklin's own experience, you know, in weathering change and reinventing yourself, it really has allowed Penn to lift up this essential piece of its ethos that has existed for a long time. And I really think that that's one of the greatest gifts that we could give this generation is, you know, the transparency that all great discoveries come with some bruises, and you know, that failure and the need to pick yourself back up is a critical piece, and what we're going to need them to be really good at as they, you know, go out and help shape the world.
Great, thank you for your perspective. You've been at Penn for around a decade in total, with a change of scenery for a few years at other institutions. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what are some significant changes, if any, that you've observed at Penn from looking at the institution overall and also from Penn admissions?
Sure. Yeah, I actually, it's interesting because I was just informed that the College of Arts and Sciences is rewording their major, the biological basis of behavior, to simply neuroscience this year. And what's sort of interesting is that I remember the discussion around the biological basis of behavior being this sort of interdisciplinary major and trying to get students to really wrap their heads around the idea that multiple disciplines combined together to give us a holistic, you know, understanding of, you know, brain science. Well, now that's second nature to students, right? That was only a matter of years where really students got, you know, very comfortable with buzzwords like design thinking and interdisciplinary studies, and you know, the dissolving of the hard lines between departments and creating more of like a blurred line in an academic ecosystem. And a lot of that can be observed at Penn in not only the creation of new initiatives, new buildings, new spaces, new intentional partnerships between different schools, between different disciplines, but it's also definitely in response to emerging interests that we see among students, right? It's increasingly difficult, and it's always been a challenge, I think, for Penn to explain itself to a high school aged population where we're asking you to choose one of 4 undergraduate schools to be your kind of home base within this larger world of Penn. but especially as the way that students are starting to think about themselves in the world is that they want to grab a little bit from here, a little bit from here, a little bit from here, and put it together in their own journey. And so helping students understand that the structure of Penn is meant to enhance their learning and keep them moving forward, it has definitely been a challenge that admission has had to take up more and more. And if you notice on actually the undergraduate admission website, a lot of what has been celebrated lately is using individual stories of young alumni or current students to demonstrate the pathways through Penn, right? To sort of say that, no, there's ways that you might come, and it might start out with something as simple as a statement, I want to be an actor. But the evolution that that takes and the way that you add to it by drawing on extracurricular research as well as academic opportunities, this is not a one-size-fits-all institution, which I think makes Penn particularly well poised to be able to pivot in moments like this.
Great, thank you. And with the current landscape of the pandemic, how do you think colleges should be redesigned to adapt to changes?
Yeah, so one of the things that's facing a lot of colleges and universities right now in this very moment is that simply because of lack of access to safe, standardized testing environments, almost every college and university has moved to a test optional format in their evaluation model, Penn included. And now with that comes a variety of challenges. One, applicants probably won't believe you that you're truly test optional. And then, they'll continue to kind of stress about, how to take the exam and should they put themselves or their health at risk. The other is, how do you start to, in a large and talented applicant pool, if you take away one piece of information that you're receiving, what does that mean for the process? What does that mean for your understanding of a student's ability to succeed when they might enroll at Penn? And also, now it's starting to lift up the variation in curricula across the world. And one of the biggest challenges that's coming out of this moment is that while there's certain moments where opportunities in different schools and education settings can shine, it's creating tremendous inequality. So issues that already existed, it's exacerbating them in a lot of cases. And so you have, to the point where I'm not quite sure, for the next 2 or 3 years, 11th grade isn't going to look like 11th grade, everywhere. And 11th grade in the United States, even from district to district, depending on the way that they handled this pandemic and what kind of learning module they used, what sorts of assessments were suspended, if they had like a project-based learning approach, how did they have to adjust that? Did students go through a year or even more of pass-fail learning? And what does that tell you about their ability to handle an engineering curriculum, for example? So there's a lot of just unknowns, and it really, the support that we can put behind kind of K through 12 education of getting them up to speed and creating kind of consistency there is going to be really, really important as to how well we as a world come out of this in 5-10 years.
Great, thank you. And Rajesh, do you have anything to add to Jordan's perspective here?
Well, first of all, thanks, Jeanette, for having us here this evening. And I can echo a lot of Jordan's comments. Similar things are happening here in the UK at Imperial College in terms of the unprecedented nature of how we teach now. More moving towards, of course, remote. One difference is that our university, and Jeanette, you went to Imperial College, and Chris as well, so you have this experience, is that our university has been at the forefront of digital transformation for quite some time now. So we have a number of online programs. So the adjustment wasn't as abrupt, especially for master's programs. But for the undergraduate adjustment, it was quite similar as what Jordan is describing over back at Penn. The students coming in with the different testing regime in terms of how do they even gain admission here. The examinations were disrupted. That was a big issue in the UK government. We also have a highly international student body for especially master's programs, as you would remember, Jeanette. So we're looking at how to bring in students from all over the world and how to get them with their visas in. Some of our programs are 95% foreign. So how do we ensure that they can all access these programs? And the real challenge there is creating that initial touch point. So we feel that it's possible to move towards a more online type of education. And that's been the model with these online MSc, online MBA, and all those programs. But they're all based on you at least have an initial meeting where you see all your cohort. And from that connection, that physical connection, then you can expand into more online education. And unfortunately, this year, that hasn't been so easy for a lot of the students. On top of that, our university, we engage in a lot of trips abroad as part of the student experience. That, of course, has been disrupted for this next year as well as from last year. And this is something that I do as part of my teaching. I take the MBA students on a journey abroad and the MSc students as well. So these kinds of reductions in the value of the one-year MSc or one-year MBA, our programs being only 1 year, is real tough for the students. And that's the question that our administrators are looking at is how do we make the most of this year for the students, given the tuition that they pay and that they're only spending 1 year, making the most of both the learning outcomes as well as the social aspect of that 1 year degree. The undergraduate program, similar challenge, though here it's 3 years for undergraduate degrees, depending on the exact degree. So missing out on 1 year is especially tough in the UK higher education system.
So do you think education has changed or technology has changed the way that you and your colleagues engage in research and teaching over these past few months?
Yes, definitely. So on the research side, most of the research that we do in the business school can be done remotely. So you're looking at data sets, you're running studies. Some things, though, do require a physical presence, and that has been disrupted. The major disruption for academic research, at least in business schools, has been the loss of conferences. We don't see each other, our co-authors. We don't have these academic conferences where a lot of the connections are made. In other fields like natural sciences, they rely a lot more on the lab. And fortunately, those things are still continuing. I think they've been able to keep those COVID safe at Imperial College. So that research has not been disrupted too much. I would say the biggest disruption on the academic research side is in the PhD program. So I teach PhD students as well, and some of the students are starting off just now, and they're going to have a difficult time making this adjustment, establishing connections with advisors. And in many of the fields, a good percentage of the PhD students will continue on to become faculty. That's their goal, is to be an academic. And with these disruptions happening in higher education, it becomes quite uncertain for them to figure out their career path. So that one area is especially challenging, and it's related to the research side. And your second question, Jeanette, I forgot you were asking about the research, and then changes to the teaching. Yeah, so the teaching with technology, that we've actually been working on for a number of years, trying to set up a good ed tech infrastructure for online teaching. And so it wasn't as difficult of adjustment for the university as a whole, but there was also a lot of demand for those resources, and all at once. And for some of the faculty, it was a new mode of teaching. So for instance, what I've been doing in the last month is we have a video room where we record brief videos for our online classes. And that room is in a lot of demand right now to get all the faculty to come in and record their videos, 5-minute videos or 2-minute videos, professionally done, and then all the editing of that so that we can launch more of the classes online, move those face-to-face towards blended, and that requires a lot of resources. So we have been prepared for moving towards online, but we were not expecting a sudden surge of demand for those kinds of resources all at once.
Okay, great, thank you. And then the next question is for both of you guys, to Rajesh and Jordan. So there has been a lot of debate over the value of in-person college education, and potentially some prospective students have concerns over whether to apply to college or not in the next year or so. So do you foresee colleges to remain online? And what's your perspective on the next steps for traditional in-person college?
I guess Jordan could start first, or yeah.
That's a great question. I think that what everyone is paying attention to right now are what are the things that can be done well without sacrificing some of the things that we used to prize about in-person gatherings. What are things that that are actually giving us greater flexibility? One of the biggest impacts on this is that I think it gives colleges, universities, and really any educational model the freedom to think outside the schedule, the freedom to think outside the daily schedule, the freedom to think outside what a year looks like, what does a pathway, and if we can do that, and if we can kind of like embrace that, what this freedom, might bring, then maybe we'll be able to combine the best of the in-person with the best of the flexibility in a remote setting. The other thing, though, that it really largely depends on is making sure that faculty, staff, administration, that the bigger infrastructure, of a university is supported to always be in front of its students. I think that that is kind of a challenge right now, is that for years you had students that were probably supplementing some of their learning with like YouTube lectures and other things. And now, we in a lot of instances, fortunately not so much at like, some of the larger, well-resourced, research universities, but at a lot of again, K through 12 schools and secondary schools around the world, everyone was playing catch up. And in order for a platform that's virtual to really be effective and meet students and parents' needs, it's got to be ahead of their own learning. It's got to be something that kind of meets everybody both where they're at, but also anticipates needs. I've been laughing here. My son is in kindergarten and we've been doing virtual kindergarten. And what's funny to me is that even something as simple as Zoom, making a kid-friendly version where instead of microphone icons that they've never seen, what about just a mouth open or a mouth closed or something like that? So it definitely is going to take innovation and people understanding how we have repurposed tools that maybe weren't initially designed with this in mind. But I think that the opportunity for kind of hybrid models are out there, and just letting us kind of shake off any of the false restraints that we were putting on ourselves in entirely brick and mortar model.
So yeah, I would build on Jordan's comments. I totally agree that there's a lot of opportunities here for digital transformation, rethinking the way we do higher education. I'm still optimistic that, of course, there's going to be room for traditional universities in the future, but it's also about having choices. So we've been following one model for every kind of student out there, and this model doesn't necessarily work for everyone. I would expect universities like the University of Pennsylvania and Imperial College in the future will still be doing face-to-face instruction, but also with the blended teaching. We've seen how successful it's been this year. So in the future, I could see us adopting that more wider scale. But a university offers so many different sources of value, including the social aspect and the career component of it, which is just the recruiting and hiring, that there's a lot of value to the students who want to enroll in the full-time higher education on campus. So I expect that that value will remain in the coming years, but we do need to adapt because the expenses of universities are also getting quite high, relative to if we run everything online, of course. So I think students now will, and families will start to question our economic model of how much we charge for tuition relative to the value that they're getting at the back end. But again, it's also about having all different kinds of students with different needs, and there's different segments there some who would still love to have the face-to-face model, and others would prefer a very different model. And I think in the future now, people are going to feel a bit more free to choose across different ways of learning.
Great, thank you, Jordan and Rajesh. So we've talked from the admissions and the professor's perspective. So now we'd love to hear from the EdTech experts in the room. So maybe George can start because I know you have prepared a little presentation to walk us through the opportunities and challenges of online learning.
Thanks. Firstly, can you hear me, right? You can hear me. Yes, okay, great. I'll just try to make this PowerPoint work. And yes, okay. Well, I went to Penn in 2006, graduated in 2008, and then before Penn I was lawyer. After Penn I was working in finance in New York and then in London. And in 2011, 12 actually, I decided to move to machine learning, and it was challenging. It was challenging because I had to go back again to university. My family didn't want to hear anything like this. My friends were against it. No one actually, but wanted it. You know, I don't like. I worked in private equity. It was interesting, but it was not intellectually challenging enough for me to like it. So what I've done, I decided to take on this charge and study myself. And it was end of 2011, and I saw the two professors of Stanford, Peter Norvig and Sebastian Thorn, providing AI class online for free. At the time, they were both Stanford professors, and I took this class. We were 110,000 students. They were expecting like 500, no more than that. And we suddenly were there, 110,000, and we were like all collaborating. It's the first class, and we were really into it. And actually, I started learning a lot from this class, but I saw that I had to review my math background. It was not enough. I can't really learn something if I don't know every single bit of it. And so what I've done, actually, I started reading after this class, and suddenly I saw that there was a Coursera. So Coursera was founded by Andrew Ng and Daphne Koller. They were both teaching at Stanford also, and they were actually teaching machine learning and PGM, probabilistic graphical models, which are kind of slightly advanced machine learning. And I took both of those classes, and I was like, it was a huge thing for me. It was my dream came true, because I suddenly saw that I could have taken those brilliant classes online without me going to the US or dedicating time to and it was free. Well, money is not actually the most important thing. Is that it was actually possible for me to move forward with those classes. So that's the way I started, and I started also helping AI startups from 2012 in Madrid mostly, but around the world, raising funds, and I was helping them in actually developing machine learning technologies. And that's how I ended up in EdTech, not all the EdTech, but I learned AI myself from online classes provided by Coursera, Udacity, and EDX, as well as MIT OCW. And now I'm writing papers. Actually, I'm preparing one paper now, very important one, according to some, in artificial intelligence. And all of this came from online education. Okay. Now, this is my personal trip, so I will quickly skip. This is actually my screen of the course designer. Actually, I'm designing now courses in AI with New York University. And well, these are some of certificates that again, actually, I have more than 100. But the most important ones are here: Udacity. You can see them, New York University, Google Cloud, Stanford Online, against Stanford, and many others. Okay, so and this person is actually a linear algebra professor at MIT, and when MIT open sourced these classes, this is professor who taught me to teach linear algebra, and he will be my guest now at Wharton Club of UK when I will be holding a meeting on EdTech and technologies needed for how to teach better. He is now well known actually worldwide. He has 15 million students worldwide, and he is well known for his teaching methodology. And well, bits of history, I will quickly show you those 5 which I was in touch. ArchDigit is really old. Then came MIT OCW, to me very personal, Udacity, and then EDX and Coursera. Opportunity, as I said, was most important, that actually I could have taken classes which I could not otherwise. When I was in Penn, I wanted to take some classes, but they were not offered in fall. Some of them were offered in spring. So I could not really manage my schedule. And now everything is online, okay? And most of them. And if there is something that is not online, I can always substitute with something equivalently good. Now it's like golden age of education for me. Well, and this opportunity comes with a cost. And the cost for me, when I was teaching already, when I was sharing back my knowledge with other students, was isolation and checking progress. This is a huge problem in online education. It's not like you cannot, yes, you can organize these tests and proctoring exams, but it's not the same. So you need interaction with students. So for this, we had local online groups and local groups, and they were helped by researchers, professors locally. We used actually professors from Imperial when we were teaching our class, NYU class, about reinforcement learning in finance. And this worked in tech. So in tech, this is different. In tech, you need feedback. You need constant feedback because you need to know whatever you designed or solved is correct. In social sciences, you are allowed to have some uncertainties. So this is different because in social sciences, you can bypass this immediate feedback. This is light touch, but it's important one. And then, well, this I already more or less described. So those, especially professors who like teaching, they are very useful for you if you are designing classes online. And well, at the end, I ended up actually designing my my own interface, AI interface, fully based on AI. It's a chatbot which will be basically replacing or replacing or helping students to be always up to date, to check whether they are up to date or not, and then to help them to be in touch with each other. So it would solve our isolation problem. And this is a solution which we are testing now, and it's fully AI based. It looks like it works because students who succeed with this interface are much better in traditional exams, and actually are having more rich experience during their classes. So this is my personal experience. Now, if you are taking classes this year at Penn, you probably won't have so many challenges of isolation as I did when I was doing studying for myself. So feel free to contact me if you if you need any help. Reach me out. I'll try to help you. I'll try to even provide you with my AI solution whenever it is available. And well, I'm open to questions now or after the event. So this is my email, and feel free to be in touch.
Thank you so much, George. That's great. And last but not least, we'd love to hear from Jake. So Jake is the founder of General Assembly. Jake, welcome.
Hi, thanks.
Hi. So you co-founded General Assembly about 10 years ago. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey? So particularly your vision and what kind of challenges you were trying to solve back then?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, GA has its origin really in the last big crisis of 2008, 2009, when I was actually graduating from Wharton Business School. And I, you know, as I went out into the world, there was something very interesting happening, which is that the sort of typical paths and typical sort of professions that were sort of driving elite students into, you know, corporate law, investment banking, and so on, very clearly had started to wane. And in New York City especially, it was very clear that there was almost this resurgence, this moment around tech and innovation, and really a lot of young people wanting to pave their own career paths in a different way. This sort of dovetailed a little bit with my my sort of you know, path to Wharton, where I had graduated from college in 2000 into another recession, and found that, you know, outside of those very traditional career paths, there wasn't a lot of ways to get a foothold in areas of the economy that were frankly growing, right, and more exciting. And all this sort of came together with this idea that could we, in this new context, create the talent that tech needed to keep growing, and what we saw in high demand among our friends with startups, and also provide a different path that is, you know, lower cost and thus higher ROI for people looking to start a career in these sort of newfangled areas and disciplines. And that was everything from software development to UX design to, you know, practical data science and data analytics. And, you know, I think I guess sort of at this point, it's very clear we hit a nerve, and we grew very fast all around the world with this model. And it was in some ways very novel at the time for a company trying to innovate in education, because we were actually doing our primary mode of instruction was still offline in classrooms. And this is when the Coursera's and the Udacities were getting heavily funded, and the story was everything was going to go online. And we sort of took this other approach, and I don't think either approach is wrong per se, which is that if you look at education as a media business, meaning it's about content in the form of knowledge being delivered, there are clearly more efficient ways of delivering knowledge in its purest form via the internet. This is just like Spotify and Netflix and what has happened to a lot of these sort of content areas that get converted into bits and then have zero marginal cost. But if you look at why education is such a big part of our world, it's mostly because it is often for people either the largest or their second largest check they ever write in their life, or the largest amount of debt they ever take on in their entire life. And so we really took this attitude that education, if you look at it through the lens of an investment business, as opposed to a media business, you can come to different outcomes. And one of them is it's about return over cost. And so that is the primary mechanism with which people evaluate their options and make comparisons on one hand. And the other thing is that you know, like any investment firm, your brand and your investment returns are your calling cards, and you have to invest in those as an entity and then protect them, you know, very aggressively. And so we essentially started from that place and built these 3-month programs that have the ability to really like take someone from very little experience to being employable as a junior level software engineer, junior level UX designer, junior level data scientist, so on. And it was in that sort of model that I think what we were doing is we weren't necessarily like, obviously if you go to Wharton for graduate school, your earning power is much larger even right out of the gate than it is when you start as a junior level UX designer. However, the cost that we were asking people to incur, both in terms of time, which is, I think in some ways the larger cost of education, and tuition was a fraction of such. And so we were actually increasing returns by decreasing the denominator and making it more efficient and therefore more sort of consumable and less of an intense once in a lifetime type of decision. And you know, that was sort of where I would say we drove our success. Now, then let's zoom forward to today, where we are now in another financial crisis that I think is with its own set of flavors that is, I think, going to accelerate some of the trends that we are already seeing around people asking really hard questions around how much should things cost and are they worth it, and what is required for them to be worth it. And I think, what's so interesting about this COVID moment, I'm not the first person to say it, although I have been saying it for over 10 years, is that the problem with an online-only approach is that it works fine for a temporary period during a global pandemic. Everybody understands. But the challenge is, and by the way, the institutions all have this pressure, if you need to charge full tuition for an online experience, you're sort of pulling back the curtain on what game is being played, which is that the cost is not really connected to these beautiful buildings and this in-person experience. The cost is due to a brand and a cost structure that you need to support as a student. And I think for schools like Penn that are at the top of the brand heap, that's not really a big problem. And I think, mostly because they have lines of people waiting out the door to go and to get that brand on their resume. And that will, if there was an open auction for seats at Penn, I'm sure you could sell one for over $1 million a year, right? So there's some pent up demand there. But if you think overall of this entire university system, there are a lot of companies that had no choice but to charge full tuition and really pull weird moves of getting everyone to go to campus for a week and then send them all back as a way of getting that tuition, because if they didn't, they would have gone bankrupt. And there is an incredible financial crisis really on the horizons for the vast majority of universities in the United States. And I'm sure that is reflected also around the world, although in some ways we in the United States have gotten especially dependent on these very, very large checks every year for tuition. And so I think coming out of this, we're going to see, I think, even a more extreme evaluation of ROI in the context. And I think now with online now being sort of, let's say, sampled by a much larger set of the population and experiencing it, you're probably going to see some new models come about, right? And the challenge is going to be that those new models no longer need to cost $50,000, $60,000 a year. The problem is this entire system, professors, even this alumni call is probably subsidized by somebody, right? There is a lot of this overhang of infrastructure that is in some way or another dependent on that very large check and all that money sort of filtering down through this system. And as disruptive technologies come, at first it's great. You can charge online, your margins skyrocket, everything is great. But over time, it really opens you up to new disruptors. And I do think this next generation of online, the first generation of online was really sort of in a way Netflixification, right? That's what Coursera did. Instead of Netflix got all the Disney movies, and then Disney realized what kind of a mistake that was, Coursera got all the Ivy League university brands to come, and then they kind of realized, wait a minute, but I think they'll work their way through it. But the next generation is going to be actively thinking about how do we provide an ROI in a virtual environment where we don't have any of the costs, just like GA did in the last 10 years, but can deliver it with a zero marginal cost and truly scale globally. And I think these are sort of the next 10 years of stories that we need to look forward to. And I think really, thoughtful people in the university context are definitely already thinking about this, of what is the value proposition in a world that looks radically different than the one that we've known our entire lives. And frankly, for the last 100 years, right? Nobody alive has seen, a different type of model at work. And so it's sometimes very hard to imagine it. And it's definitely, you can imagine the first order effects. Oh, we'll take more classes online. But what about the second and the third order effects of that? What happens to this very expensive physical plant that schools like Penn have been investing in for centuries? Does it still have value? How much value? What's the willingness to pay for that value? These are going to be all the questions, and I think there will be winners and losers in that context. And I think, you know, my personal view is schools like Penn are going to be fine. A brand that communicates globally and has way more demand than they offer supply is in a very good spot. But the overall system is really going to be ripe for disruption. And I think it's something to watch. And COVID is in many ways going to accelerate it way faster than I think people thought was going to happen otherwise.
Great, thank you. So do you consider General Assembly to be kind of like a competitor to Penn? Like, are most people going there with already higher education or kind of no higher education?
It's a great question. When we started, we actually very intentionally said to ourselves and to anyone who would listen that we did not see what we were building as an alternative to undergraduate education. And honestly, it was just very simple. There was just, if you look at the consumption patterns and the reasons people go to undergraduate, it's a very hard spot to disrupt. There is a basic, I look at it as almost a dogmatic religion in most of the developed world that you need to go get your undergraduate degree, you need to get it from as good of an institution as you can go, and it's in many ways what determines your social worth at some abstract level. So, but what we really looked at is that graduate school has a very different set of consumption characteristics, especially professional type schools like business school, which was my experience, which is that usually the decision to go is not a family decision, it's an individual decision. It's done with a very specific ROI kind of calculation that if not implicit, you know, if not explicit, at least implicit in that decision. And, you know, and it's made with a very specific set of goals when someone comes out of those programs. It's not a place for discovery as much as it is for manifestation, right? And self-actualization. And I think to actualize those goals. And I think we felt like that was a much easier place to present a different formula for ROI that would be appealing to some people in that consumption set. And so that's sort of how we always thought of it. As you could see, you know, we saw a lot of people sort of take versions of the GA model, kind of carbon copy it, maybe manipulate it a little bit, and then claim that it was going to replace college. And we sort of always looked at that with a sideward glance, because if you look at why people go to college, what they're hoping to get out of it, especially elite colleges, that doesn't really align with what something like General Assembly offers. And we never wanted to offer that. So I don't see that even today as a threat. You know, we would have to really lose a lot of our sort of core liberal values as a society to think that, you know, 12-week vocational training in technology should replace 4 years of arts and sciences. Like, that's not really a rational trade at this point. But I do sometimes wonder, what are the disruptors of the liberal arts, right? I often wonder, does it really truly make sense to have our 18, 22-year-olds sequestered learning and reading all of the great books and learning about all this stuff when their brains are barely developed and they're much more interested in their social lives and who they are as they sort of, you know, become and discover their identities, right? And I think there's a lot of opportunity for this concept called lifelong learning sort of brought to the liberal arts. And I think that, to me, is probably one of the biggest opportunities I haven't seen someone really grab at yet. That, who knows, maybe Penn could do it. I mean, I think there's a big revenue opportunity in it for sure.
Great, thank you, Jake. So I think we're gonna take a couple of questions from the audience for Q&A. So first we have Andrew here, who asked, do you foresee any pricing pressures on business schools or master's programs, given that the offering online is moving closer to MOOC or massive open online course? Which one of our speakers would like to take that?
I mean, I think that was sort of implicit in what I said. I think you've seen it explicitly. I mean, Coursera, their big plan going pre-pandemic was essentially to offer a $20,000 MBA program with some pretty good brands attached to it. And that was sort of, I looked at that very interestingly because that was sort of bridging this gap of the sort of OPM, the online program manager model, which was charging full price for these very elite degrees, with the MOOC model that was all about sort of cheap and free and global scale, to something that really did create some level of pricing pressure. But it could take a long time for that pricing pressure to work all its way through. I think in the pandemic, you've already seen pricing pressure, and that the amount of discounts that the average university is offering has increased pretty significantly.
Great, thank you. And another question from Andrew is, with exams being done from home, how can schools or professors ensure that the results and quality of grades are reflective of the student's capacity? Maybe our professor here can elaborate on that. Carissa, could you unmute Rajesh?
Okay. Yes. So definitely this past year was unfortunately a bit of a loss. The students suddenly took their exams from home, and we didn't have all the systems in place to facilitate that. So it's going to definitely be a challenge, and we'll have to involve more technology going forward. So the way we've done our examinations this past year, the students took it at home, but there was no way to tell if they were consulting external materials while taking the exam. But there's some technology that allows you to actually monitor through looking at the eye gaze of the students while they're taking an exam from home to ensure that they're completely focused on the exam. But we haven't yet installed those kinds of that software yet for our exams. I think it will be, probably in the future, will be implemented.
Great, thank you. And the next question is from Victor, who asked, what's your view on regulations and accreditations? Who wants to take on that?
I mean, I've been pretty public about this, that I think, there's a lot of different types of regulations. I think the most important, and that what we see in our world, is that there's this idea of consumer protection, which is when you're promising something that is very expensive, where the fruits of it could be many, many years in the future, the sort of tendency towards fraud, or at least misrepresentation and sort of exaggerated marketing, is quite high. And the need to sort of regulate that, I think, is always going to be present, as long as it costs money. I would say in terms of accreditation, I personally believe for this part of the world that we operated in, which is the sort of pseudo-vocational training, that, accreditation coming from some third party that aren't the employers hiring our students is a little absurd. And so we've done a lot of work building sort of consortiums of employers to accredit what we do via the actual hiring of our students, and as opposed to some sort of abstract academic framework that made sense 100 years ago, but not as much now.
Great, thank you, Jake. The next question is from Emily, and she asks, as someone who works at a top-tier research university, I'm curious if you think that teaching should be separated from research. So who wants to answer that question?
I can take that. So I think in general,
I would just add specifically related to costs, because research is very expensive, and we've been talking about delivery of teaching as being affordable, which I totally agree with. We've seen that with community colleges, but should we be segregating those things to achieve the cost? Sorry.
Yeah, so to comment on that, in general, when you think about a university, it offers a package of so many different things. And there's a big question about how do we decouple all of those different objectives of a university. So it includes the teaching side, and that's what many of us experience. So for instance, when we went to Penn, you were focused on that student learning experience that you had. But other stakeholders include the government, and your research is part of that whole process at Imperial College. We do a lot of research in medicine, sciences, and there's a number of other institutions that we contribute to as a university. So it's going to be difficult to try to separate those things out because it's all part of one overall brand of learning and education and how we contribute to society as a whole, especially here in the UK. That's Imperial College's mission. So I don't think that the two will be separated anytime soon, in part because the whole reasoning behind how universities exist is that this is a serious place of learning, and it involves also the faculty doing cutting edge research. And that's part of what students buy into. And building off of what the comments made earlier, it's still a part of our overall notion as a culture, what is a university about? So until that is lost, until that kind of mindset changes, which I don't see anytime soon, I don't think the two will be disconnected. As far as whether they should be disconnected, I definitely think there are some universities where, again, this is about choice. Some students don't necessarily want to have that research experience around them. They're not looking forward to those opportunities. They're really looking for a different kind of learning experience. And I think what we've been doing for too long in higher education is just pushing one model on everyone, when we should be offering more choices across the whole menu of different universities that are out there. So I do expect that some universities will move towards, move away from research and move more towards delivering on teaching and other aspects of the package of what we give to students, including the social life and all the rest.
Yeah, I agree with most of that. I think I've always viewed this conversation about what's going to happen to research. When that conversation hits the mainstream, you will know that the higher ed disruption is really in main swing, right? Because this is, I think what we were just talking about is this, it's a cross-subsidization sort of via a bundling approach that made sense, but a lot of the narratives around why it makes sense, I think you could easily argue are post-hoc rationalizations or justifications, or isn't this nice that it works like this? And I think, I think you're already seeing pressure in some ways. The job market for PhDs hasn't gotten better in a very long time, right? And I think that is in some ways maybe the clue of pressure coming, right, and getting worse. But it's not, when you start hearing about, Midwestern third-tier universities abolishing tenure and things like that, then you'll know that things are getting real in that. And I think it's going to be a really important social conversation about how should research be funded and what kind of research should be funded at what level. Do we really, how many Shakespeare scholars do we need? Does every university need a Shakespeare scholar in order to be a real university? Is that like a rational use of our resources? I love Shakespeare. So I'm not like against it per se, but if you think about the total cost of some of those sort of decisions that are made completely reflexively at this point, I think a lot of those are going to come under the microscope, and it's going to be an interesting time.
And one more thing, actually, if you go and look on the citations in Google Scholar, you'll see that actually 80% of papers are never being cited anywhere. Especially, this point is especially valid in social sciences. I'm not sure. So those criteria are coming more and more relevant in our world. So is it really worth having this research, which is not ever read after it was written? I'm not sure, so I'm just wondering. I don't think so, personally. Yes.
Great. Thank you. And the next question is from Carrie to Jordan specifically. So did Penn increase the number of offers to students this year as SATs were not taken into consideration? Will SATs be excluded for next year as well? And have you seen fewer applicants from low-income families?
All great questions. So just a point of clarification, this cycle right now that we're receiving applications for is the first for Penn as a test optional process. There's also a difference out there between a university calling itself test optional versus test blind. Test blind, that means that even if you took the test, we don't want it, we're not going to look at it. We're removing testing as a factor for every single applicant. Penn, the rest of its highly selective peers have not gone that route yet. It's still a test optional, meaning that if an applicant so chooses to submit testing, then it would be considered as part of their materials. And if they don't, it won't be held against them. Now, one of the, one of the arguments, to go test blind instead of test optional is often that students that are less resourced, students that are less savvy, don't have guidance counselors, don't have college counselors in their schools or even private, they won't understand whether or not their score is going to help or hurt them. And so you might have students sending scores that they're kind of mediocre in the grand scheme of things, whereas a more savvy student from maybe a higher performing school might not send scores that were the same. And it was because they had somebody, they had that advice, they had that extra touch point. So this just goes back to this moment is really kind of lifting, exacerbating kind of inequalities that really already existed out there. The other piece is that what did happen last year is that there was an admission cycle. And at the point where the pandemic was causing everything to shut down and go online, that's when admission decisions were released. And so you had a lot of families have to make a decision in a month about what to do for the fall. And so you did have a higher number than usual, although it really isn't anything that's going to disrupt the process too much, but it was a higher number than usual who requested to defer their enrollment. Instead of entering in the fall of 2020, they'll now wait, and they're essentially on what you might call a gap year, and they'll enroll in the class of 2021. That did lead to additional activity on, the wait list across different universities, right? So opening up opportunities that might not have otherwise existed in a typical year. All that to say that still, Penn didn't have as great a challenge as the large percentage of colleges and universities in the United States of meeting its enrollment goal. We are in a fortunate position. There's a lot of brand awareness and brand recognition. What is happening as far as income distribution and applications is, and this will grow even more pronounced possibly in the years to come, is similar to coming out of 2008, you started to see the emergence of a barbell effect, essentially, where it was your applicants were coming from two distinct populations, where it was families who were at the lower socioeconomic end of the spectrum and families that were at the higher socioeconomic end. And then everyone in the middle started to kind of disappear and started to, seek more, again, going back to those were the families that were looking most critically that return on investment and at that value proposition. And they will continue to be the families, that do that in this moment. And there will be more families that find themselves in that position. And so I think it's going to be a kind of interesting few years, but it's something that we're paying attention to closely. I think that let's have this conversation in April of 2021, and it will be a lot of interesting information that we'll be able to share.
Great, thank you, Jordan. And the next question is, what do you think about the trend towards celebrity academics, such as Professor Scott Galloway, breaking away from the universities and developing and monetizing their own online courses directly with consumers? Do you think faculty will start demanding percentage of their course sales?
I think the more interesting question is, can they demand a percentage of the course sales, right? And, in many ways, this is, if you look at the university as a content machine, like a Disney, your celebrities going off and getting better deals at Netflix is a constant risk. And I think you're kind of seeing little versions of that. I think the reality is it's a pretty, the kind of academics that can go off and do that are pretty far in between, and to be honest, like tenure is still a pretty good deal for most researchers. So I don't know if you're going to see that anytime soon in mass, but it is an interesting trend to watch. It's something at GA we thought a lot about in terms of not wanting our instructors to frankly be the celebrities. And we did a lot of work to make sure that it was the curriculum and the GA way that was sort of front and center, and not a specific teacher or instructor, because we knew that that would be unsustainable and would open us up to that kind of, diaspora.
Okay, I think the other thing is, actually, I know a lot of professors already, they don't really ask for a percentage, but they are just releasing videos. I think they can do so. And what they do, they have websites like Patreon or other subsidiary websites where you can actually donate money. And I know a lot, actually, at least 20 professors from diverse universities having like 100K per month from those donations. So this is alternative way of not buffering, not being in conflict with the universities, having your own website, and then having donations if you are a star and can make money out of it. I don't see why they should not. In my opinion, they are doing so, and I think it's a good thing for them to be motivated and remain at the university and without really having a conflict with the place they work at.
Great, thank you. As we're running a little bit over time, potentially one last question. So from Edwin, what's your view on the long-term total addressable market for businesses like General Assembly? And will large tech companies start taking stakes or venture into this space? So I think that's more for Jake.
I think that's a great question. I think, in theory, the addressable market is everyone who currently engages in some form of education in some way, but that's at a very, very theoretical level. And I think the ceilings for what we do is primarily not driven by the demand, but actually the supply of viable employment opportunities on the other end, on one hand, and financing opportunities on the front end of it. And I think those are really the two drivers of it. And the ability to create an ROI out of that formula that actually makes sense, whether it's via government or employer subsidies or consumer credit or any of those types of things. And, even at Wharton, I would say, probably a good chunk of the tuition comes from employer paid executive programs and things like that. So that's not, these things do matter, and looking at that from an addressable market perspective, I think you have to look at it from the payer and from the output as much as anything else. You have seen tech companies participate in our market in a number of different ways, passive investing, even a couple small acquisitions. My perception is that a lot of the tech companies are interested in it primarily from the framework of they think of it like media and publishing on one hand, and also they look at the top line addressable market of education, and frankly, they need any big market they can get their hands on to keep their growth story alive. And I don't think you're seeing a ton of massive success with it, because I think it's a much more nuanced, fragmented view underneath. And you really do have to, as we've been talking about, to have to deliver real value. But, I wouldn't be surprised if you saw, especially out of this sort of COVID explosion of volume for some of the online players, that, one or two acquisitions by a Google or that kind of thing. Although whether or not those are successful or meaningful to the landscape really is yet to be seen.
Great, thank you, Jake. And so that concludes our talk today. Thank you so much to all our speakers. So thank you, Jordan. Thank you, George, Jake, and Rajesh. And thank you to all of our audience today for joining us. So we have pasted here from Carissa a link for donation to the Penn medicine research for coronavirus. So if you enjoyed the event, please do donate. to help with the efforts. And we look forward to seeing you again at future events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.